for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And again, I appreciate this. My difficulty is going to be trying not to delve too deep in some of the conversations that we've had, but I'll try to avoid that. Dr. Solomon, you mentioned several potential applications for your research in the gut microbiome of cattle and other livestock. Could you elaborate on that? Because I'd like to, the next step after you discuss the process, and I want to know what kind of challenges you foresee in translating your research into products and solutions.
So just to recap, I work with microbes that we can find in cattle, sheep, and other ruminants and hindgut fermenters. What they do is they break down the ingested plant material and help other microbes digest that in a way that allows them to provide nutrition to the host animal. They also produce a number of compounds that essentially control which microbes are present and what they do, and the specific identities of those microbes and how many of them there are lead to have an impact on how healthy an animal will be. And so my research tries to understand this and try to understand how to control this. Specific challenges that I see is that as we've discussed right now, that the implications of that research, at least from that dimension, are very clearly agricultural. However, the way that our funding system is set up, for example, the different agencies, they tend to prioritize technologies at different levels of readiness. And so fundamental basics science such as this can be difficult to fund in this environment. And so trying to have a more coordinated framework that has an eye towards these more long-term outcomes, I think would be very beneficial.
Thank you. Second question would relate to gene editing and the gene editing technology. This is for you too, Dr. Solomon. I'm sorry about that, but anyway. And it relates to crossbreeding and hybridization techniques that we've used for years in agriculture. So how does that relate to what we're doing with this gene editing technology, in your view?
So what I think gene editing allows us to do is that it allows us to do these things more effectively and more rapidly than we've never been able to do before. I think in the past, biological research has enabled us to do these things in a controlled fashion. However, at the end of the day, you get what you get. With the techniques that we have available to us, we can actually custom print DNA sequences, and we can actually do this with such precision that these advances can happen in a matter of weeks, months, as opposed to years, which is what has happened in the past.
So we're running close on time. So the one last question, if I may, I might have each one of you respond briefly to the idea that the United States and Europe does have some differences in terms of their interpretation of regulations and policies relating to biotechnology. Could you just quickly give us a feel for that, how that might impact some of the products that we could produce from this process, these processes?
Well, just to start, it will have an impact, and certainly some of the companies that we have invested in are seeing a more challenging regulatory environment in Europe than in the United States. And that's, of course, because the precautionary principle is built into the European Union's fundamental structure, and they have to be cautious. They have to move very slowly, and that will impact our ability to sell to them, but also it will slow them down. You know, there are companies leaving Europe simply because they can't get anything done and have no hope of selling what they make there.
Thank you. Dr. Stone?
I mean, I'm not sure I have much else to add beyond what Dr. Carlson said, other than I think in this new and exciting space, I think that we have not agreed on what definitions are. And so, for example, if we take GMO, what would be GMO and safe in the U.S. might not be GMO and safe in Europe, and vice versa. And I think until we harmonize and agree on those definitions, there's always going to be some friction as to what can and cannot be sold.
Dr. Haig?
I think one of the most important things that we can do to help alleviate this problem across the globe is to continue to provide the information that people need to make informed decisions. And I think that's where higher education can be critical. And so I think we need to continue to do it here in this country, and I think it also probably needs to be done, for instance, in Europe as well. I think many of the decisions that are being made are sometimes made by people who are ill-informed about the subject matter at hand. So I think education will be critical across the globe.
While there are clear differences in terms of opinion and legislation regarding genetically modified organisms between Europe and the US, the area that actually impacts us as a company commercializing biotechnologies is, for example, regulations around what constitutes a renewable or low-carbon fuel. For example, in the US, the renewable fuel standard dictates what a biofuel may be produced from. It basically says that it has to be made from a plant material. In Europe, rather than dictating what a fuel should be made from, legislation now seeks to define what the outcome of the production of a fuel should reflect, i.e., a degree of carbon reduction or carbon emission reduction. And so now in the US, the legislation in this field is somewhat dictatorial in terms of defining what resources can be used. And in that sense, in my view, is somewhat anti-innovation, because it takes away the power of innovators to develop new ideas with new resources to achieve the outcome that I think legislators had in their mind. Whereas in Europe, the legislation is somewhat more technology agnostic, and so is leaving the field more open for innovators to develop new ways to harness available low-cost resources for the production of renewable or low-carbon fuels.
There are two reasons why it's a different climate in Europe. One of them is the precautionary principle, and that grew out of a German romanticism and German idealism that says don't do anything unless you can prove that it won't make the world worse. And Americans don't like that principle. American philosophers are pragmatists, and we think the way that things are now is also bad, and so making an improvement is just a matter of going forward in either a world with improvement or a world without. So we use a risk-benefit analysis, a very different kind of philosophy. But secondly, Europe is tremendously affected by the Shoah, the Holocaust, where the German scientists who were in the lead, especially in the chemical industry, saw despite their technological prowess, they were ethically bankrupt. And of course, that tragedy means people are very cautious, especially in the EU in general, and in Germany as leaders in particular. Now, the UK, in looking at this, sees the EU environment as so potentially restrictive that the House of Lords had a committee hearing very much like the one you're having here today, that worried about the same question. How can the British scientists move forward when they're very close to a restrictive atmosphere in Europe? And the same conversation happens in the UK as it does in the United States relative to the much more restrictive environment in the EU. And that's played out in terms of the use of GMOs, GMO crops, which has been banned in many cases in the EU and in their trading partners, but not in the United States. So that comes at a very different history. And I think that history is something we can build on.
Thank you.